The note was handwritten in pencil, the letters pressed hard into the paper like the man had wanted them to survive longer than he would. To whoever was brave enough to come down, this place chose you. She read it twice, then a third time. The tin box sat open in her lap, its lid still carrying the impression of the nail that had held it sealed under the shelf for how long exactly, she still wasn't sure. The stove crackled beside her left shoulder. Warmth moved across her in slow waves, the kind that reaches bone only after bone has been cold for days. Her boots were on the floor by the door. Her socks were draped over the stove's side rail, steaming gently. Outside, the canyon fell away from the ledge in a drop she had measured with her eyes, and still not quite believed with her body. 300 feet of open air. The far wall of the gorge was close enough to throw a stone at in daylight. At this hour, sometime past midnight, she guessed, she had no watch. It was only a faint, dark mass and the sound of the creek at the bottom, far below and out of sight. She was inside. She was warm. She had a roof and a cast-iron stove and a box of paper in her lap that appeared, by every measure she could apply, to be telling her she owned it all. What she could not yet fully process was the part that came before, the getting here, the decisions that had seemed, at each step, like the only reasonable thing to do, and in aggregate looked from the inside of this warm room like something a different person had done, someone with more nerve than sense, or possibly no nerve at all, and only an absence of better options. She set the note on the shelf above her, smoothed it once with her thumb. Her pack was on the floor beside her boots. Canvas, faded green, the left shoulder strap repaired twice with paracord. Inside, the folding multi-tool, the water bottle, the road atlas with its cover soft from handling, a change of clothes she hadn't needed yet, and $3, and some coins that hadn't been enough for anything in a long time. She'd left Colorado Springs 4 days ago with those same 4 items, and that same small weight of coins, and nowhere particular to go. She'd been running the back roads, because back roads were free, and forward motion felt better than standing still. She'd ended up at the rim because of the crane, and she'd ended up looking hard at the crane because of the smoke. That was the beginning, the smoke, thin and pale, rising out of the gorge in the early stillness of morning, when the canyon was cold and the air hadn't started to move yet. She'd been standing at the rim, not knowing it was a rim, just walking the edge of the road where the gravel gave out, and she'd looked down into that impossible depth and seen something that shouldn't have been there. A column of smoke, rising from a ledge she could barely see, from a cabin that no road reached, that no trail touched. She'd stood there for a long time, looking. She should tell this in order. It makes more sense that way. So, day one. She'd slept on the canyon rim because she hadn't known it was a canyon rim. She'd pulled off the gravel road at dusk when her feet had given their final argument. A blister on the right heel had been building for 2 days, and the road atlas showed nothing useful within what felt like reasonable walking distance. She'd found a flat patch of dirt behind a stand of scrubby juniper, unrolled nothing because she had nothing to unroll, tucked the canvas pack under her head, and watched the stars appear in a sky, so dark and wide, it seemed almost aggressive about it. She slept badly. The ground was stone under a half-inch of grit, and the temperature dropped faster than she'd expected. She pulled her second change of clothes out of the pack and put them on over the first, and that helped some. Somewhere in the night, a wind came through the trees and smelled like cold water and something else, a mineral smell, clean and faint. She noticed it without knowing why she noticed it, and then she slept. The light woke her before the sun cleared the ridge. That particular mountain light, gray going blue, everything in sharp outline before color arrives. She sat up, and the first thing she saw was the crane. She almost didn't register it as a crane. It was a silhouette at first, a tall, angular shape against the sky to the east, and her brain tried to sort it into something familiar. A dead tree, a radio tower. But the geometry was wrong for both. Too angular, too purposeful. One long arm canted out over nothing. She stood up stiffly and walked toward it, and the ground dropped, and she was standing at the rim. The gorge opened beneath her feet like something that had always been there, indifferent to the surprise it caused. She couldn't see the bottom in the low light, only depth. The far wall a half-mile away, still in shadow, the near wall dropping in shelves and breaks and ledges until it disappeared into the dark below. The crane's gantry was bolted to a steel plate set into the bedrock of the rim, the whole assembly tilting 5 degrees toward the void, as though it had been thinking about it for years. The basket, a rectangular cage of bent iron rods, hung suspended over open air, swaying just slightly in a draft she couldn't feel from where she stood. She was looking at the crane when she saw the smoke. A thin thread, pale as chalk, rising from somewhere below the rim, from some ledge she couldn't quite resolve in the low light. It moved straight up for 20 feet, and then the canyon's morning stillness broke it apart. She watched it for a full minute before she was certain it was real, before she could separate it from the mist that collected in the gorge at night. It was real. It rose, dispersed, rose again. Something down there was warm. Something down there was burning, or had been burning very recently, and the residual heat was still working its way up out of that impossible depth into the cold morning air. She looked at the crane. She looked at the smoke. She looked at the $3 and some coins in the front pocket of the pack. She stayed. She gave herself until noon. That was the deal she made standing at the rim, looking down at nothing she could fully see. Until noon, she would work the problem. After noon, she would decide whether the problem was even hers to solve. She started with the gantry. Up close, it was bigger than it had looked from the road. 8 feet of welded I-beam bolted to a concrete footing that someone had poured directly into the canyon rock. The bolts were corroded but seated. She kicked one base plate and felt nothing give. She put her shoulder against the upright and pushed, testing the whole structure the way you'd test a fence post you were about to trust your life to, and the gantry didn't move. The concrete had cured into the stone so thoroughly that 50 years of high-altitude freeze and thaw hadn't loosened it by a millimeter. The frame was solid. She traced the cable hand over hand from the basket all the way back to the drum. It was aircraft-grade wire rope, 7-strand, thick as her thumb, and whoever had installed it had done so with care. No fraying, no kinking, no corrosion she could find beyond surface rust that wiped off on her fingers in orange-brown dust. The pulleys at the gantry head were stiff, but she could work them by hand, rotating them through their range of motion until the bearings loosened slightly. The sheave grooves were worn smooth and even, not chipped. Someone had run this cable for a long time. The brake drum was another matter. It sat at the base of the hoist mechanism, a cast-iron cylinder roughly the size of a dinner plate and about as responsive. She wrapped both hands around the brake handle and pulled. Nothing. She reversed direction and pushed. Nothing. She worked it back and forth for 20 minutes, putting her whole body into it, and the drum did not move a fraction. It had seized, not bent, not broken, just fused into itself by years of rust penetrating the gap between the drum and the shoe, until they had essentially become one component. The gap between them was barely visible. A dark line, uniform all the way around, as though someone had drawn it there with a very thin pencil. She needed penetrating oil. She needed time. She had neither, at least not yet. She left the crane and walked the rim. She walked north for 40 minutes, picking her way along the canyon's edge through scrub oak and loose shale, looking for a route down, a slope, a talus field, a section of cliff that stepped rather than dropped. She found nothing. The canyon wall varied from vertical to slightly overhanging. At one point she found a chimney crack that descended maybe 30 feet before it ended, at a smooth face. She dropped a stone into the gorge and didn't hear it land for longer than she was comfortable with. She walked south from the crane for another 30 minutes and found the same answer. The canyon refused her. She came back to the crane at 11:30. She stood in front of the seized brake drum and looked at it without expression. The smoke wasn't rising anymore. Whatever warmth had been down there had spent itself against the morning air. But the stove had been warm once. She was certain of that now. She went back to her pack and uncoiled the paracord. 50 feet of it. She'd measured it once, in a ditch outside Pueblo, when she had nothing better to do. She held it doubled and thought about what the canyon wall had shown her on the walk north. The chimney crack that died 30 feet down, and below the crack, just visible from the rim, a narrow shelf of sandstone jutting out like a drawer left open. She hadn't paid it much attention then. Now it was the only thing that mattered. She walked back to the crack and looked down at the shelf. 25 feet, maybe 30. The shelf was 18 inches wide at best, angled slightly inward, enough to stand on if you pressed yourself flat against the wall and didn't think too hard about what was beside you. She looped the cord around the base of a ponderosa pine, whose roots had grown into the canyon rim like they had an argument to make. She tested it. She tested it again. She tied a figure-8 loop at the working end and put both feet into the crack, facing the cliff. The descent was ugly. The crack was too wide for solid opposition and too narrow to be comfortable, and the sandstone was dry enough to be gritty, but smooth enough in places to offer nothing. She used her knees. She used her elbows. The paracord burned through her palms in a way that suggested this was not a technique with a long operational lifespan. She hit the shelf after what felt like 4 minutes and might have been 2. She stood against the wall and breathed. Below her, the gorge opened outward. The opposite canyon wall, maybe 300 feet away, was striated with orange and gray in bands as clean as paint. The air was cooler down here, and still. She could hear water somewhere, not close but present, a thin, continuous sound, like something patient. She looked along the cliff face and found the gantry almost immediately. From the rim it had been a vertical view, all foreshortening and confusion. From here she could see the steel frame bolted to the rock face, the vertical struts, the horizontal brace at the lower level, and there, mounted directly to that lower brace, no more than 12 feet south of where she stood, a flat-roofed metal box, about the size of a steamer trunk, welded to the gantry. Hinged door, padlocked. She looked at the distance and the terrain between them. The shelf she was on narrowed but didn't disappear. If she moved carefully and didn't lean outward, she could reach that box. The padlock was the kind that rusted open if you looked at it sternly enough. It came apart with 2 firm strikes from a fist-sized rock she found on the shelf. Inside, a half-full can of penetrating oil, a brake wrench, T-handled, with a rubberized grip, 4 rags folded into squares, and in the back corner, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine that had stiffened to wire, something the size and weight of a small book. She didn't unwrap it yet. She already knew, from the shape and the careful packaging, what it was. She tucked it under her arm and looked down. 200 feet of air stood between her and the ledge, and the crane above her was still broken. The climb back up was harder than the descent had been. She moved with her arms full, the penetrating oil tucked against her ribs, the brake wrench looped through a belt loop by its handle, the oilcloth package wedged between her back and the pack straps. 3 points of contact on the rock face at all times. She counted handholds the way other people counted prayers. By the time she pulled herself over the rim, the sun had dropped behind the western wall of the canyon, and the air had gone from cold to serious. She didn't stop to rest. Rest was for after. The brake drum on the crane's lowering mechanism was a cast-iron disc about the diameter of a dinner plate, and it had been seized so long it had essentially become part of the gantry frame, rust acting as its own kind of weld. She soaked it. poured the penetrating oil slow and deliberate, working it into the seam between the drum and the housing with the corner of a rag, letting it wick down through the rust by gravity and capillary action, rather than forcing it. Then she waited, sat with her back against the gantry leg, and looked at the stars appearing above the canyon walls one by one until there were too many to count. She soaked it again, tried the wrench. The drum didn't move. She ate the last of the crackers from her pack, 6 of them, the ones she'd been rationing, and drank half her water bottle and soaked the drum again. The temperature dropped. She wrapped her second shirt around her hands to keep her fingers from stiffening and worked the wrench handle in slow, deliberate arcs, applying pressure without jerking, feeling for any give in the mechanism the way you feel for a knot loosening underwater. Nothing, then a faint tick, then nothing again, for 20 minutes. She soaked it a third time and lay down on the gantry platform with her eyes closed, and set herself to wake before dawn by an old trick she'd learned in a foster home when alarm clocks weren't available, thinking the hour hard before sleeping, pressing it into her mind like a thumbprint in clay. She woke in darkness with the canyon below her, invisible and the stars beginning to pale at their edges. She picked up the wrench. The brake shoe released with a sound like a rifle shot, a sharp, percussive crack that bounced off both canyon walls and came back at her twice before fading. She stood there a moment with her heart hammering, the wrench still in her hand, the drum turning free and smooth as the day it was installed. She found a canvas sack in the tool shed's upper cabinet, filled it with rocks from the rim until she estimated the weight at something near her own, loaded it into the ore basket, fastened the hook latch, released the lowering brake by degrees. The basket descended. The cable ran smooth through the sheaves. The drum paid out at a controlled, even speed, neither racing nor catching, and when she applied the brake it stopped, held, and stayed. She hauled the sack back up, tested it twice more. The mechanism worked. Below her, in the dark, the canyon waited. She gave herself until the sky turned gray. Not because she needed more time to think. The thinking was finished, had been finished, since the test sack swung back over the rim and she unloaded the rocks one by one in the dark. She needed the light! Not much of it, just enough to see the ledge beneath her, to watch it grow from a shadow into something real. She sat with her back against the gantry leg and her pack across her knees, and listened to the canyon fill with the soft, undirected sound of wind finding its way between walls. First light came as a thinning, not a brightening. The black softened to deep blue, then to the gray-green, particular to high country mornings in July, and the ledge materialized below her the way shorelines appear through fog, gradual, then suddenly there. She could see the garden terraces now, the cabin roof, the thin dark thread of the spring channel running along the cliff base. She pulled on her pack, clipped the chest buckle, and climbed into the basket. It was larger than it looked from outside, a riveted steel cage, waist-high walls, big enough for 2 or 3 people, or a load of ore. She found the control line coiled on its cleat, checked the hook latch, checked the lowering brake, and stood upright with both hands on the line. She released the brake by a single notch. The basket swung outward over the rim, smooth on its pivot, and for 1/2 second there was no floor under her, just open air, and the canyon dropping away in both directions, and the far wall catching the first pale stroke of dawn across its limestone face. Then the descent began. The cable ran through the sheaves above, with a low, steady sound like breath. She lowered herself by degrees, feeding the brake in small increments, and the canyon rose around her. The rim receded. The walls came in on both sides, closer than they had seemed from above, their surface reading now as texture, ledges, cracks, a cluster of columbine forcing its way out of a seam 40 feet down. the dark stain of old water streaks running in vertical lines toward the gorge floor far below. Cold air pooled at the lower elevation, the way cold air always does. Heavy, still, faintly mineral. It pressed against her face, and through the weave of her jacket, she could smell the spring from somewhere below, a clean limestone smell, the smell of water that has not seen sun. The ledge came up slowly, the terraces resolved into rows. She could see bean plants now, or something like them, and the flat stones someone had laid as a walkway between beds. The cabin sat at the back of the ledge against the cliff face, its single window dark, its stovepipe showing nothing at this hour. She set the brake at 10 feet above the surface and let herself hang there for a moment, still, suspended between where she had been and what this was. Then she eased the last 10 feet down, and the basket touched the stone with a low, final sound, and she unlatched the gate and stepped out. The ledge held her weight. She stood there in the early gray light, with the canyon walls rising 300 feet above her, and the spring murmuring somewhere close in the dark. She didn't go to the cabin first. That instinct surprised her, but she trusted it. She moved along the ledge instead, close to the cliff face, letting her eyes adjust to the gray. The terraces came into focus one by one, 4 of them, stepped down from the cliff wall toward the canyon edge, each one edged with flat stones set on end, like a low fence. The garden had been put to bed for winter. Whoever had done it knew what they were doing. Straw mulch lay thick over every bed, packed down with the weight of several weeks' weather. Bean stakes had been pulled and stacked in a bundle against the cliff, tied with a length of twine so neat it looked like it had been measured. She crouched beside the nearest bed and pressed 2 fingers into the mulch. The soil beneath was dark and faintly warm, alive in the way that tended soil is alive, not the dead gray dust she'd been walking over for days on the rim. A rain-catch system ran along the upper terrace, a shallow trough carved from split timber, angled to collect runoff from the cliff face above, feeding down through a series of wooden pipes into a stone-lined cistern near the cabin wall. She traced it with her hand. The wood was old but intact, sealed at every joint with something gray and cracked but still holding. Someone had spent years perfecting the angle. The cistern was 3/4 full. The water was cold and clear. She went to the tool shed next. The door opened on leather hinges worn smooth with use. Inside, tools hung from a pegboard in descending order. Shovels, hoes, a mattock, a hand axe, a draw knife, 2 rasps, a coil of wire. Every hook was labeled with a strip of leather, branded with a letter. Nothing was missing from its place. The floor had been swept. She stood in the shed doorway for a long moment. This wasn't abandonment. Abandonment looked like the places she'd been sleeping, things fallen over, things left where they dropped, the slow erasure of purpose. This was something else. This was a person who had kept their house in order until they couldn't anymore. The boot paths told her the rest. The stone walkway between the garden beds was worn into the rock itself. Not the stones, but the cliff ledge beneath, polished smooth by decades of the same steps, in the same direction. From cabin to garden, garden to cistern, cistern to shed, shed to the crane platform at the far end of the ledge. The same circuit, walked so many thousands of times that the mountain itself had memorized it. She went to the cabin last. The door was unlocked. A simple wooden latch. No key. Inside was one room, a cot with a folded blanket, a table, 2 shelves of labeled jars, a small writing desk with nothing on it, and the cast-iron stove centered against the back wall. She pressed her palm to the stove's side. Barely warm. Not the warmth of a fire set days ago. The warmth of coals banked down to almost nothing. The way a person banks coals when they expect to be away for a while, or when they know they won't be coming back. She held her hand there and felt the last of it against her skin. She stood with her palm against the cooling iron for a long moment, then let it drop. The shelf ran the full length of the wall above the stove. Two wide planks of rough-cut timber, heavy enough to hold the weight of the labeled jars, the folded linens, the coil of spare wire. She looked at them the way she'd learned to look at everything on this ledge, not just at the surface, but beneath it. The underside of the lower shelf had something fastened to it. She crouched. A tin box, small enough to fit in both hands, nailed flush against the wood, with two finishing nails, and sealed around the lid with a thick ring of red wax gone brittle with age. It had been put there deliberately, not stored, not forgotten, placed. The nails weren't structural. They were meant to keep the box from falling if the shelf ever shook. Someone had thought about what might shake it. She worked the nails loose with the flat blade of her multi-tool, caught the box before it dropped, and sat down on the floor with it in her lap. The wax broke cleanly along the seal line. Inside was a folded sheet of paper on top, and beneath it, a small brass key on a wire ring, a larger folded document, with official stamps visible through its crease, and 3 composition notebooks stacked flat, their covers soft with age. She read the letter first. The handwriting was careful and unhurried, the penmanship of someone who had written a great many things alone and taken time with each word. It was not addressed to any name. It began simply, "To whoever was brave enough to come down." She read it twice, then a third time. It was not a long letter. It said that the ledge and the cabin and everything on it had been his for 33 years, and that he had known for some time he would not see another spring. It said he had considered many arrangements and dismissed them all, because any arrangement that required paperwork or lawyers or next of kin would bring people down here who hadn't earned it. So instead, he had left it to the crane. Whoever figured out the crane deserved what the crane could reach. That was the whole logic of it. No name required. No proof of anything except the fact of arrival. The deed was filed in 1961 under a land grant that predated the county's current survey system. It was legal. It was real. A hand-drawn map on the back showed the boundary lines of the ledge property in precise, careful ink. The key was for a lockbox in the root cellar. She set everything on the floor in front of her and looked at it. The letter, the deed, the key, the 3 journals, 3 notebooks full of 33 years of daily life on a ledge that no road reached, no map named, no neighbor overlooked. She pressed one hand flat on the top notebook's cover and felt its soft give under her fingers. Outside, the canyon was going gold with late afternoon light. A swallow crossed the gap between the walls and disappeared into shadow. She did not open the journals yet. She just sat with them and let the weight of what she was holding find its way through her slowly, the way warmth does. She rose before the afternoon light left the canyon walls. The crane. She had to trust it once more before dark, going up this time, and that felt different from going down. Going down had been surrender to gravity, a controlled fall, a bet placed on her own repairs. Going up was something else. Going up was a claim. She rolled the deed carefully and slid it inside the water bottle for protection, wedged among the folded atlas pages. The journals she packed flat against her spine, wrapped in the spare shirt. The key went into her front pocket, where she could feel it with every step. She banked the stove the way she'd watched the damper work, slowly, thoughtfully, and then crossed the ledge to the crane's lower platform. The ore basket rose without complaint. She worked the hand crank in steady pulls, watching the cable for any sign of fray, listening to the drum turn. The brake held clean. 300 feet of wall moved past her in slow vertical miles, the limestone close enough to touch, the ledge below her shrinking to a thin brown line, and then to nothing. The canyon air was cooler this high, sharper, and when the rim came level with her boots, she stepped out onto solid ground and stood still for a moment, getting used to the sky being open again. 2 miles up the canyon road. The walk took her 35 minutes, at a pace kept deliberately steady, the deed wrapped in the water bottle knocking softly against the inside of the pack. The county records office shared a building with the post office. A low cinder block room with fluorescent lights and a metal filing cabinet behind the counter that looked like it hadn't moved since Eisenhower. The clerk was a middle-aged man with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. She set the deed on the counter and explained what she needed, without explaining anything she didn't have to. He looked at the deed for a long moment. Then he went to the cabinet and pulled a drawer and ran his finger along the tabs. He found the file in under 2 minutes. Filed 1961, he said. Land grant, pre-survey parcel. Never contested, never encumbered. He looked up at her. You the heir? According to the letter, she said. He nodded once, the way people nod when a fact is simply a fact, and stamped the copy. At the general store, she spent the last of her coins on cornmeal, salt, dried beans, and a small tin of coffee. When she set the stamped county copy on the counter alongside her coins, the store owner looked at it for a moment and looked at her. The Crane parcel, he said. It wasn't quite a question. Yes? He studied her, the way people in small towns study things they've wondered about for a long time. Then, he pulled a small notepad from beside the register. I'll start you a tab, he said. Bring me your first herb bundle when you've got it. She carried the supplies back down the canyon road as the light went amber and flat, the pack heavier now, the key still in her pocket, the journals still flat against her spine. The rim was waiting. The crane was waiting. Below, the ledge held the last of the day's warmth like a cupped hand. She descended at dusk, hand over hand on the crane's newly greased cable, the basket riding smooth and level all the way down. The brake held. She had tested it twice with a weighted sack before she trusted it with herself, and it had held both times, and now it held a third, and she stepped off onto the ledge as the last orange light left the top of the canyon wall. The stove was cold. She built a fire from the split wood stacked beside the door, small pieces first, then larger, and waited until the iron ticked with heat before she set the tin of coffee on the flat surface. While it heated, she found a small nail already in the cabin wall, just above the stove shelf, as though it had been waiting. She took the note from her breast pocket, smoothed it once, and hung the frame she'd fashioned from 2 flat scraps of pine board she'd clamped and notched that morning in the tool shed. It wasn't perfect. It held. To whoever was brave enough to come down, this place chose you. She read it once more. Then she turned around and got to work. The journal gave her the garden's seasonal map in the former owner's careful hand, what he'd planted in each terrace, what had reseeded itself, what wanted attention before the first frost came. She took his third journal outside with the last of the light and walked the terraces slowly, naming what she could see. Sage, thyme, oregano gone slightly woody at the base, but still producing. A row of calendula he'd used, the journal said, for salve. 2 kinds of winter squash he'd started from saved seed. She counted the squash. 11 fruit set, most nearly ready. She wrote the count on the inside back cover of the journal in small, even numbers. The root cellar was cool and dry. She lit the candle stub she'd found on the shelf and held it up. Empty canning jars ranked along one wall, 31 of them. Bushel baskets, clean and folded flat. A coil of baling wire, a box of extra candles still in their paper sleeve. She made a list in the margins of the journal. Jars, 31. Wire, candles, root vegetables to move in before frost. She oiled the crane mechanism before she slept, working by candlelight at the rim, after climbing back up the cable hand over hand, a habit she was already forming. Cable joints, brake housing, the pawl and ratchet both. She had found a full tin of marine grease in the tool shed, and she used it deliberately, not generously. the way someone uses a finite thing they plan to keep. When she finished, she lowered the basket down to the ledge on its own so it waited for morning, then climbed down via the outcrop rope she'd left rigged on day 3. She lay down on the cot. The spring ran somewhere in the dark outside the cabin wall, quiet and consistent, a sound that wasn't silence but was close enough to rest inside. She had a list. She had seeds to count in the morning. She had the deed stamped and copied and filed, and the journals read halfway through, and the terraces mapped, and 11 squash coming in. She was already working. She was already home.